Strange lights playing a game of tag in the sky. What are they? A sinister metal mass suspended over the sea. What is it? Fireballs lighting up the night. A sudden searchlight beam from the underside of a strange craft. Objects escaping from Earth's atmosphere at incredible velocity. What are they? Could aliens have visited the Earth? Some writers have suggested that mysteries like the ancient patterns drawn in the Peruvian desert at Nazca, which can only be wholly seen from the air, have an extraterrestrial origin. Could the figures in this prehistoric cave painting represent creatures in spacesuits? Or the geometry of Maya temples point the way to the stars? Could stranded alien visitors have fashioned the brooding statues which dominate Easter Island? Scientists and skeptics have dismissed these theories, but they exercise a strong hold on the public imagination. In the Middle Ages, the citizens of Nuremberg saw strange lights in the sky. And the first photograph of an unidentified flying object, a UFO, was taken in Mexico over 100 years ago. But it was during the Second World War, when technologies of all kinds were making giant leaps forward, that sightings of UFOs began to increase. Were the forces unleashed by the conflict being monitored by observers from outer space? On the 25th of February 1942, the inhabitants of Los Angeles were still recovering from the shock of the attack on Pearl Harbor. Defenses were being prepared for an anticipated Japanese invasion. But was there an alien invasion of the West Coast? This retouched photograph shows searchlight beams around a strange aerial object over Culver City. The incident was reported to the U.S. Army's Chief of Staff, General Marshall, and in turn he informed President Roosevelt. Later in the war, American bombers encountered strange lights flashing through their formations as they flew over enemy territory. Were these so-called Foo fighters a German secret weapon, or were they of extraterrestrial origin?
An engine on fire.
A new and terrifying era dawned in 1945 with the testing of atomic weapons and then their use against Japan. Combined with the Cold War, the nuclear age held out the prospect not only of limitless power, but also of limitless destruction. Once again, could this have prompted an alien civilization to monitor the Earth more closely? Enter American civilian pilot Kenneth Arnold, who in 1947 coined the term flying saucer when he encountered a formation of flying discs near Mount Rainier. They buzzed his light aircraft at an estimated speed of 1,300 miles per hour. Sightings were now pouring in. In July, the pilot and crew of a civilian DC-3 on its way to Seattle ran into another gaggle of flying discs. Official concern over the mounting number of UFO sightings by seemingly reliable witnesses led to the appointment of Lieutenant General Nathan Twining to compile a report, which was initially classified secret. Twining stated that the phenomenon reported is something real and not visionary or fictitious. The sense of a growing security threat was heightened by the strange death of a US Mustang pilot, Captain Thomas Mantell, in January 1948. Mantell was flying at altitude, without oxygen, chasing what he reported as a colossal disc-shaped object. The wreckage of his Mustang was found scattered over a mile of Kentucky countryside. There was no shortage of sightings from the ground. This amateur footage was shot in Montana in 1950 and has been the subject of close but inconclusive analysis ever since. Does it show two alien craft, or the sun bouncing off a couple of service jets circling to land at a nearby airfield? In July 1952 came the so-called Washington Flap, the biggest UFO scare in American history. A series of sightings was followed by a hectic 24 hours in which flying discs played a cat-and-mouse game with US Air Force fighters. The progress of the discs was caught on radar screens, which estimated their speed as up to 1,000 miles per hour. Dozens of eyewitnesses saw the discs float over the Capitol, like a science fiction movie come to life. Inevitably, hoaxers were now moving into UFO territory. But this photograph of a flying saucer, taken in Oregon in 1950, has never been satisfactorily explained. 1953, Luke Air Force Base, a USAF training station in Arizona. The pilot of one of the field's Thunderjets spotted a UFO, gave chase, and, flying at 30,000 feet, captured it on film with his gun camera. No other military aircraft were reported in the area. In November of that year, another American jet fighter was lost while pursuing a UFO which had been picked up on radar. These sightings were filed in Project Blue Book, which had been set up by the Pentagon in 1951 to analyze UFO activity. Blue Book eventually logged some 12,600 sightings before it was wound up in 1969. The files can now be inspected in Washington at the National Archives. Blue Book was essentially a public relations exercise. The records of a more shadowy intelligence gathering outfit, the U.S. Army's Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit, founded by General Douglas MacArthur in 1945, have never been made public. In the early 1950s, pilots of the British Royal Air Force also encountered UFOs, this one on a training flight over southern England.
By the time we got to the overhead position, it appeared to be moving at quite a fast, fantastic speed, and my impression of it, more or less a photographic impression, was of a round object, quite distinct outline, still with the same intense light, with the maximum light around or towards the periphery of the circle.
In 1958, the crew of a Brazilian naval vessel engaged in marine research off an island in the Atlantic saw this strange object. One of them, a keen photographer, took these pictures as the object moved in and out of the cloud base before suddenly shooting off at great speed. In January 1976, film was being taken of a British Concorde as it was cruising at subsonic speed. Then something very peculiar takes place. A silver ball seems to slide down past the airliner and then bounce up to travel alongside it before disappearing whence it came. Here it is again in slow motion. British Airways dismissed the phenomenon as a foreign body in the camera lens. There have been hundreds of well-attested UFO sightings by the crews of airliners. In November 1986, a Japanese airline 747 flying from Iceland to Alaska was tracked by a huge walnut-shaped UFO estimated to be at least twice the size of an aircraft carrier. In 1962, General MacArthur, the founder of the Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit, warned the U.S. military academy at West Point, "You now face a new world of change. The thrust into outer space marks the beginning of ultimate conflict between a united human race and the sinister forces of some other planetary galaxy." It was widely rumored that astronauts encountered alien space travelers during the countdown to the first moon landing. Inside the descending lunar module, astronaut Buzz Aldrin flipped the switches to film the approach to the moon's surface. This is what the cameras captured. Was the lunar module being closely observed by the crews of alien spacecraft? A Japanese UFO magazine doctored the pictures and claimed that they showed an alien attack on the lunar mission. The story spread like wildfire, but the UFOs were merely reflections of lights inside the lunar module.
We have main engine start. 3, 2, 1. Solid motor ignition and liftoff.
The space shuttle has also provided its quota of extraterrestrial curiosities. The Discovery shuttle, orbiting 350 miles from Earth, captured on film several objects seemingly escaping from the atmosphere at phenomenal speed. In 1985, Ronald Reagan, who himself claimed to have seen a UFO from an airliner, told Mikhail Gorbachev that their task would be much easier if suddenly there was a threat to the world from another species, from another planet outside the universe. If the amateur astronomer George Adamski was to be believed, encounters with aliens have a long pedigree. Adamski claimed that this photograph, taken in the early 1950s, shows a Venusian scout ship with whose occupants he made regular contact. Another of Adamski's photographs shows a cigar-shaped mothership apparently disgorging its brood of scout craft. Adamski's photographs and his encounters with humanoid alien beings provided classic profiles for ufologists. But his plausibility was undermined by later claims, including a trip to the moon, where he found forests and animals, and meetings in Los Angeles motels with emissaries from Mars and Saturn. Adamski's truthfulness was perhaps as shifting as the Californian desert sands on which his spacecraft settled after their long journey. Lingering physical evidence of an alien encounter was provided in 1967 by the burns suffered by Stephen Michalak when he approached a landed UFO near Lake Falcon in Canada. A blast of hot air from the craft left a pattern on his stomach which matched Michalak's recollection of its exhaust vent. In November 1975, an Arizona forestry worker, Travis Walton, found himself confronted with a mysterious craft hovering over a clearing.
It was hovering up here, just below the tops of the trees, and it was about 25 feet in diameter. And I could hear a sound coming from it. It was kind of a very strange mechanical sound. And I was kind of wrestling with the idea of being so close to this. I'd expected it to take off, you know, and in running up here, I figured this was my last chance to, you know, to see this thing up close. But I decided I'd better get the hell out of there. And as I raised up and turned to go, I felt this numbing shock and blacked out.
Walton claims he came to inside the craft, where humanoid aliens conducted medical experiments on him. Later, he submitted himself to 2 lie detector tests to determine the truthfulness of his tale. But the results were inconclusive. Was Walton a liar, or had some traumatic experience tripped a false memory of alien abduction in his brain? On a November night in 1976, Mrs. Bowles and Mr. Pratt were driving home from Winchester in southern England. First, they noticed a bright orange light, seen by many other people that evening. Then the controls of the car went haywire.
We were doing about 20 mile an hour, maybe 20, 25 mile an hour. Done about 70 yards then. All of a sudden, this car suddenly went crazy. It just leapt off the road to the right, and the engine started to rev. We hit the grass verge, which is a very wide grass verge, about 15 yards wide.
That was when we see what I shall say a cigar-shaped object hovering in front of us. Inside were three figures.
Yes, they had like a cockpit. In the cabin was in the front of the cigar-shaped thing, and was lit up, but not glowingly lit up. It was a very easy light to look at.
It was hovering. It had either steam or vapour coming out like gas jets. Then I see one of these figures get out of this thing, this object, and it started walking across towards me.
Yes, it was.
Now, as it was walking across towards me, I heard a whistle.
Which I didn't hear.
So it's like a whistling kettle starting to whistle. Now, he had on like a boiler suit, but it was with a polar neck collar. He had a seam down on his right-hand side. As he walked across, he come to my window. He put his arm on the roof of my car and looked in. Now, he was a tall man, roughly 6'1", 6'2". He had pink eyes, which were very piercing.
Perhaps the most notorious of all alien encounters occurred nearly 30 years earlier, in July 1947, in the New Mexico desert. A ranch foreman found the debris of what seemed to be a crashed spacecraft. The apparently indestructible fragments of metal were unlike any earthly material. Personnel from nearby Roswell Air Force Base sealed off the area, and an official statement announced that a flying saucer had been recovered. Then the Air Force backtracked, claiming that it had found a crashed weather balloon. For many years, rumors circulated that Roswell was one of 3 crash sites in the area, from 2 of which alien bodies had been recovered. In 1995, these rumors were given controversial substance with the broadcast of an 8mm film purporting to show autopsies being conducted on the corpses of aliens recovered from one of the crashes. Skeptics maintain the film is a brilliant special effects hoax. Our sun and its family of planets is just an everyday star in an everyday galaxy. In our galaxy alone, there are 1,000,000 times 1,000,000 stars. And when some of these stars were formed, planets might also have been formed capable of sustaining intelligent life which might visit us. The UFOs which might carry these visitors take a number of shapes, including the classic saucer profile, the cigar-shaped mothership, and the glowing disk with flashing lights. But their supposed passage through our skies can often be explained by physical phenomena. This spectacular film was shot by a holidaymaker in the Rockies. It was subsequently proved that it does not track a UFO but a meteor fireball, a chunk of rock as big as a 3-story house. This bright light hovering over an American suburb is not an alien craft, but the planet Venus. This has been a frequent cause of confusion, even to experienced astronauts, as NASA engineer James Oberg explains.
On one of our space flights, Michael Collins, during one of his extravehicular activities, saw Venus rising as the sun was about to come up and thought it was his target satellite. Asked the ground if the satellite was off in that direction. And later on, of course, they found out it wasn't the satellite, it was Venus. It was even a case where a man, before the UFO phenomenon began, a train conductor backed his train off the track because Venus was coming down the track at him. He thought it was an oncoming train. So the misperception of Venus is a very common thing and doesn't imply that people are not sober or honest or clear-sighted. It implies that they're human.
An ingenious geological explanation for some UFO phenomena lies in the research conducted on the huge stresses set up along fault lines. In laboratory conditions, a piece of granite is squeezed until it reaches breaking point. The splitting granite releases a burst of radio frequency, and something else happens. Filmed in darkness and slow motion, the breaking granite also releases bright balls of plasma, consisting of hot ionized gas sustained by the radio frequency emitted by the splitting rock. These might be tiny in a laboratory pressure chamber, but would be rather more spectacular when set up by the groaning San Andreas fault. Weather balloons have been confused with UFOs. The US Air Force tried to pass the Roswell crash off as one. But could it have been debris from the top-secret Project Mogul, in which high-altitude balloons were used as part of America's early warning system? Strange lights in the sky, however spooky, can sometimes have an entirely earthbound origin. This is not a flying saucer, but a light aircraft, fitted with an array of twinkling lights which, when seen from the right angle, spell out an advertising slogan. And this is a man-made flying saucer built in the 1950s. A charming experiment, but unlikely to make the trip to Alpha Centauri. However, there may have been other secret machines which gave rise to sightings. In recent years, a spate of sightings has coincided with the testing of stealth aircraft, whose striking radar-resistant profiles could easily be confused with a UFO by the untutored eye. The simple power of suggestion can lie behind many sightings. In Britain in the 1970s, much excitement was caused by the so-called Warminster thing, a UFO which was photographed near a large British Army base in the West Country. Ufologists were convinced that the thing was genuine. In fact, it was a clever hoax, perpetrated by the British government. A civil servant explains.
We let the hoax run for some 2.5 years so that we could monitor the investigations undertaken by the ufologists. During that time, we monitored their publications. A lot of articles were written about the saucers. A lot of people attempted to analyze the photographs, but one important point about the photographs is that 5 deliberate flaws were inbuilt into them so that anybody exercising moderately critical analysis would have been able to show quite readily that they were at least not what they were claimed to be, that they were highly dubious.
The first and simplest clue was that the distance between the streetlights had been varied in what was claimed to be a continuous series of photographs. The pictures had been faked by taking background photographs on different nights and then superimposing the alien craft on them. The ufologists bought the Warminster thing hook, line and sinker. But what are these things, captured in 1978 by a film crew aboard a transport plane in New Zealand? A whole host of objects was filmed, and no convincing explanation was ever discovered.
Unidentified flying objects behind us. We'll just have to wait and see what happens.
Whatever they were, at least one of the UFOs was also caught on radar. Despite all rational explanations, there are still mysteries in the night sky. There is an underlying statistical improbability when dealing with UFO sightings. If all the incidents are to be believed, then tens of thousands of alien craft must be visiting Earth every year. If the Roswell incident really happened, for some a visit becomes a permanent stay, perhaps in the custody of the US Air Force. But there is not a shred of physical, publicly available evidence for any of these incidents and visitations. Thousands of encounters and alien abductions have produced not so much as a single alien ashtray. Could UFOs be no more than a modern projection of the demons which have haunted humans from ancient times? Or perhaps the ambiguity which surrounds their appearances is engineered by the occupants of these elusive craft? Or are governments guarding secrets they do not wish the public to know?